Jake lunged forward, but a second later he was already on the ground, clutching his bloody nose. Silence fell over the crowd. Everyone was staring at Sean, yet he didn't even look angry, just cold and calm. And then something happened that no one expected. But let's start from the very beginning. Sean Miller had always been one of those guys who went unnoticed. Not that he wanted it that way, it was just how things had turned out. In school, he was never the center of attention. His grades were average, he wasn't a star athlete, and he never hung out with the popular crowd. His place was somewhere in the shadows. Among the books he read during breaks, among the headphones that always sat snugly in his ears, drowning out the noise of the school hallways. He had long since mastered the art of moving through the building without accidentally drawing anyone's attention. Slender, slightly hunched, he seemed to avoid unnecessary contact with the world, always keeping his head down. Some thought he was just weird. Others believed he was afraid of everything. And while that wasn't true, Sean never bothered to convince them otherwise. But while his classmates simply ignored him, there were those who saw him as an easy target. Bullies. And among them, Jake Sanders, captain of the school football team. Tall, broad-shouldered, always wearing that smug grin and carrying a gaze that made people step aside without him having to say a word. He thrived on attention. He loved being feared. He loved being the strongest in the room. And even more than that, he loved picking on those who couldn't fight back. Sean had long come to terms with it. He knew life wasn't fair. He knew that guys like Jake always got away with everything, while guys like him just tried to survive another day. But that evening, something changed. On his way home from the library, Sean already had a bad feeling about taking the shortcut through the alley. He could sense it in his gut. And yet, he turned. And after just a few steps, he realized he was right. "Hey, Miller." A familiar voice made him freeze. Sean looked up. Jake stood right in front of him, flanked by two of his buddies. They blocked his path, their eyes gleaming with that same anticipation predators have before they tear into their prey. "You still owe us for the last punching bag game." Sean didn't respond. He knew there was no point. He simply tried to walk past them, but Jake shot out an arm and shoved him hard in the shoulder. The push was unexpected, and Sean didn't have time to react. His legs gave out and he hit the asphalt. Pain flared in his side, but he barely had time to process it before a boot slammed into his ribs. Then another, and another. "Look at him! The nerd's about to cry!" One of the bullies laughed. Sean didn't cry. He just lay on his back, staring at the sky. The sky was clear, a deep, dark blue, almost black, with a few distant stars flickering faintly above. Sean focused on them, trying not to think about the pain, about what it felt like to be someone who got beaten up just because they could. And in that moment, something inside him snapped, like an old rusted spring that had been coiled for years, suddenly unwinding. Sean didn't understand what it was, but he knew there was no going back. He was brought to the hospital late at night. The cold glow of the overhead lights, the sharp scent of antiseptics, the hushed voices of the nurses, all of it blurred into a single picture that felt distant, as if it had nothing to do with him. He lay on the hospital bed, staring at the ceiling while the doctor, brows furrowed, examined his injuries. "A broken rib, multiple bruises, a split lip," the doctor muttered, pressing gently against Sean's side. A sharp pain flared up, but he didn't even flinch. His mother sat nearby, silently crying. She perched on the edge of a chair, hands clasped tightly together as if trying to keep herself from breaking down completely. "Why didn't you tell me?" she choked out, her red-rimmed eyes searching his face. Sean said nothing. What could he say? That this wasn't the first time? That he had long since gotten used to it? That this night was no different from 100 others, except this time they had miscalculated the strength of their blows? There was nothing to say. He felt nothing. No pain, no fear, not even anger. Just a cold emptiness inside. The next day, Mr. Hahn walked into the hospital room. He stood in the doorway, arms folded behind his back, his sharp gaze scanning Sean's battered body. He was an older man, lean but strong, with the kind of quiet confidence in his eyes that he passed on to his students. "You could have fought back a long time ago," he finally said, shaking his head. Sean let out a bitter chuckle. "Fight back? Me? Do I look like someone who can even throw a punch?" "No," Hahn agreed. "Because you've never tried. You're afraid." The words struck a nerve. Sean clenched his jaw and sat up abruptly, ignoring the pain in his side. "And what am I supposed to do? Fight like them? Become like that piece of trash, Jake? That won't change anything." Mr. Hahn smirked. "You don't get it. It's not about becoming like them. It's about stopping them from seeing you as a victim. If you're afraid to fight, you've already lost." Those words stuck with him. They stayed in his mind even days later when he was discharged from the hospital. They stayed when he stood in front of the old, worn-down martial arts dojo that Hahn owned. They stayed when he took his first step inside. Training was hell. From the very first day, he realized just how weak he was. Every movement felt awkward. His punches were weak. He could barely keep his balance. And after just 10 minutes of warm-up drills, his legs nearly gave out. The mirror on the wall reflected not a fighter, but the same helpless kid who had been kicked around in the streets. And that only made it worse. But Mr. Hahn never let him pity himself. "You made a mistake. Fix it. You're too slow. Move faster. You fall. Get back up." Sean fell. A lot. His hands shook. His muscles burned. His lungs tightened as if he were breathing through a straw. He hated it. He hated himself. But every time he was on the verge of quitting, he remembered Hahn's words. "The most dangerous fighter is the one who doesn't fear pain." He learned to endure pain. And with each passing day, he began to understand. Pain isn't weakness. Pain is a reminder that he's still alive. 3 months had passed. In that time, nothing at school had changed. Jake Sanders and his gang still ruled through fear. They bullied, humiliated, and laughed in the faces of those who couldn't fight back. They were certain that no one here could stop them. And Sean Miller? He had disappeared. Or rather, they had simply forgotten about him. Nerds always disappear if you push them down long enough. But if they had bothered to look closer, they would have noticed. Miller was no longer the same. After school, near the parking lot, Jake and his friends had found their next target. "All right, Davis, today's training day. Let's start with a warm-up." The skinny boy in glasses tried to back away, but Jake grabbed his shoulder and, without warning, drove his fist into his stomach. Davis gritted his teeth, doubling over in pain. "Oh, come on. Does it hurt that much?" One of Jake's friends chuckled. And that's when a voice rang out. "Leave him alone." Everything stopped. Jake slowly turned his head. A few meters away stood someone they didn't recognize at first. Sean Miller. But he looked different. His posture no longer resembled that of a slouched, timid boy. He didn't look away, didn't avoid their stares. He just stood there, straight, composed, confident. His eyes were cold, like glass. No fear, no hesitation. Jake frowned. "What?" "I said, leave him alone." A brief silence fell, then Jake smirked. "You playing hero again, nerd? Let's see how brave you really are." He stepped forward and swung, and a second later he was on the ground. It happened too fast. Sean didn't just dodge. He caught Jake's arm, twisted it, and used his own momentum against him. Jake lost his balance and crashed down, barely stopping himself from smashing his face into the pavement. His friends exchanged uneasy glances, unsure of what they had just witnessed. Jake cursed, sprang to his feet, and glared at Sean. "What the hell did you just do?" Sean said nothing. He just stared. Jake lunged at him again, this time seriously. He was bigger, stronger. His fists had broken plenty of noses before. But this time was different. Sean saw everything, every move, every mistake. He sidestepped the attack, dodged the punch, grabbed Jake's wrist and yanked hard. Jake staggered, lost control, and in the next instant, Sean's fist slammed into his gut. Jake gasped, bending over from the force of the blow, and then a sharp, precise right hook. Jake stumbled back. For the first time, he looked shocked. Slowly, he wiped his hand across his nose. Blood. He stared at his palm as if he couldn't believe it. Sean took a step forward, and Jake stepped back. Slowly, almost imperceptibly. But he stepped back, and for the first time in his life, he was afraid. Rumors spread through the school faster than wildfire. By the end of the day, long before the final bell rang, every student had heard the news. Sean Miller had put Jake Sanders on the ground. It was hard to believe. The nerd, the quiet kid, the eternal target of bullies, and now he had wiped the floor with the captain of the football team. Some thought it was just an exaggerated rumor, twisted by a dozen retellings. Others, those who had seen it with their own eyes, just nodded in silence. And some still couldn't accept it, convinced that Jake would soon reclaim his reputation. But Jake stayed silent. He never mentioned that day, never tried to get revenge. And most importantly, he never looked Sean in the eye again. Every time they crossed paths in the hallways, he kept his head down. He no longer walked with his shoulders squared, radiating untouchable confidence. Now, in his movements, there was something new, caution. And Sean? Sean just kept living. He didn't walk around with his head held high. He didn't seek revenge. He didn't try to prove anything to anyone. He didn't need recognition. But there was one thing that had changed forever. No bully ever dared touch him again. And more importantly, no bully dared touch anyone else. Now, whenever they spotted someone weak, defenseless, someone they could once humiliate without consequence, their eyes lingered on the crowd, searching, just in case, because they knew Sean Miller was somewhere nearby, and now even the weakest could become legends.